The planet never slept. Not in the way Earth did, with its familiar rhythm of night and day. Here, under twin suns that took turns warming the land like indifferent gods, the world only dimmed, it never truly darkened. Even in its quietest moments, this place breathed heat, whispered dust, and watched from behind rust-red ridges like something ancient and waiting. Jack Drenner paused at the edge of a narrow canyon ledge, boots scuffing rock baked near glass by decades of exposure. His fingers twitched on the grip of his sensor pad, but his eyes weren't on the relay tower in the distance. They were staring into the light, not at it, through the orange glare and ochre dust that hung constantly in the sky like powdered rust. He didn't know what he was waiting for, but something in his chest had gone still. He hadn't spoken to another human in 12 days. Not since the cargo hauler dropped him off with half-working parts, a 6-week repair order, and a corporate message that didn't quite say expendable, but implied it strongly. He preferred it that way. Alone. Simple. Efficient. Safe. This was Sol V, one of the outer rim exoplanets on the edge of corporate expansion. Not much to look at. Dry gorges, scattered minerals, dangerously erratic weather. But breathable air and rare or beneath the crust made it just useful enough to fight over. There were rumors of old alien ruins buried deeper in the canyons, but no one with a corporate badge had ever confirmed them. It wasn't part of Jack's job to care. He was here to fix solar relays, one panel at a time, and keep the grid online just long enough for the main survey ship to finish mapping the terrain. 6 weeks, then a ride back to the core worlds. That was the plan, until he heard it. At first, he thought it was wind whistling through a rock arch. Then he stopped moving, turned, listened. It came again, thin and high-pitched. Not mechanical, not weather. A sound with pain in it. Jack's spine stiffened. Every instinct told him to ignore it. Not his problem, not part of the job. But his legs moved anyway. He started down the ridge, carefully navigating the tilted slabs of shale and razor grass. Thin, spiked plants that coiled slightly in the heat and snapped shut if touched. The air shimmered in waves. Distant dunes shifted under the weight of passing wind, throwing up fine silt that clung to the skin and eyes. Even in his breathing mask, Jack could taste the minerals, bitter, metallic like a battery on the tongue. As he moved, the cry returned, broken now, strained. It wasn't just a cry for help. It was the last thread of something that didn't expect help to come. He followed it down a narrow gully, between boulders crusted in red lichen. Spiny plants with translucent stems curled in the shadows, their surfaces pulsing faintly with bioluminescence. The air grew colder here, shaded but heavy, like something had happened in this place, and the land hadn't quite exhaled since. Then he saw it. Movement. A tangle of limbs. Blood-dark smears on stone. He froze. It was a trap. Old world, brutal, barbed steel, and bone rigging stretched between two low rock formations. But what it had caught wasn't a creature from this world. Not quite. Suspended in the snare, half-curled in agony, was a figure unlike anything Jack had ever seen in the flesh. Humanoid, yes, but not human. Her skin was blue, but not flat like paint, layered with subtle iridescence, shifting hues beneath the surface like stormlit water. Long strands of green hair, deep emerald, threaded with lighter tones, clung to her sweat-slicked skin and pooled on the stone beneath her. She was tangled, one leg twisted awkwardly, arms caught in the wiring. Blood had dried on her thigh and shoulder. It was darker than human blood, almost purple. A soft, rapid breath escaped her lips. Her eyes opened. They were unlike any eyes he'd seen. Wide, luminous silver with shifting vertical slits, cat-like and alien, and utterly, completely focused on him. Not wild with fear. Not begging. Just watching. Calculating. He raised a hand. Easy. She flinched at the sound. Her body twisted in a sharp, defensive motion that made her gasp in pain. Her fingers scraped at the trap supports, trying to pull herself free despite the damage. "Don't," Jack said, more to himself than her. He stepped forward, crouched beside the snare, and scanned it. Human-made. Portable. Old military salvage. probably left behind by some unauthorized poacher or survivalist. The tripwire had snapped from below, activated by ground pressure. Someone had set this. Not recently, but not long ago either. He scanned the ridge above. Nothing. Still, the back of his neck prickled. He turned back to her. She made a low sound. Not a word, not a moan. It was melodic, a chime-like hum from deep in her chest, trembled by pain but intentional. Not human, not a language he knew, but it struck him somewhere he couldn't explain. It wasn't just a vocalization. It was a message. His eyes flicked down. Around her neck, caught in the blood-streaked fabric of a torn vest, hung a small, iridescent pendant, shaped like an oval shard of polished glass. It glowed faintly. No text signature. Not active. Just warm. She made the sound again, softer this time. Jack exhaled and pulled out his heat knife. Her pupils contracted at the sight of it. She tensed, ready to fight, but she didn't move. Didn't scream. Didn't plead. He moved in slowly. "I'm cutting you out of this," he muttered, even though he knew she didn't understand. He placed his gloved hand on the metal wiring and pressed the knife's blade to the anchor. The tool hissed, metal curling away with a sharp smell. One coil snapped, then another. She hissed sharply, but didn't cry out. Her blood stuck to his gloves, thick and warm. "Just hold still," he said. As he worked, a thought came unbidden. She's not the first one to scream here. There were stains on the stone, old, nearly black. More than one. This wasn't the first use of this trap. He looked around again, jaw tight. Was someone watching? The last wire snapped. She collapsed against him with no strength to resist. Reflexively, he caught her, arms beneath her back and legs. Her body was light but dense, as though her bones carried something heavier than calcium. She trembled against his chest. Her breathing was shallow and fast, but her eyes, they were still watching him. Not afraid, not trusting, just studying. Jack stood, adjusting her weight in his arms. His camp was 4 kilometers east, barely within range if he cut across the lower basin and avoided the ridge. The sun had shifted. The heat would start to spike again soon. He'd have to hurry. He looked down at her again. "What the hell were you doing out here?" he murmured. No answer. Just the sound of her breathing and the faint hum of her pendant against his chest. He began walking, dust kicking up behind him, every step loud in the canyon's strange hush. She didn't speak. He didn't ask. But as the shadows stretched around them and the sky dimmed from bright gold to bruised orange, Jack had the unmistakable sensation that something was watching them. Still out there, waiting. And as the alien woman in his arms shifted faintly, one hand curling into his jacket with unconscious trust, he realized something else. He didn't want to be alone anymore. Not really. Not like this. Maybe he never had. And maybe, just maybe, this strange, blue-skinned woman bleeding in his arms wasn't a burden. Maybe she was the reason he was still out here at all. Jack didn't stop moving, not even to wipe the sweat trickling down his spine beneath the exosuit's backplate. The alien woman in his arms was growing heavier with every step. Not because she'd gained weight, but because the situation was starting to settle in his chest like stone. Her blood had soaked into the fabric of his sleeve, staining it deep violet. Her breathing came in shallow bursts, each one a quiet struggle. But she was still conscious. That was something. The path ahead cut through a dry ravine scattered with razor grass, rust-colored moss, and the occasional thistle burst. A plant that looked like a cluster of feathers until it released spore darts sharp enough to draw blood. Jack moved carefully, boots finding their rhythm on the loose stone, knowing every wasted second counted. If her body was anything like a human's, she was going into shock. If it wasn't, she might already be dying, and he just didn't know it yet. His rover was just under 4 clicks east, nestled inside a rock alcove to shield it from solar winds and storms. The terrain between here, and there wasn't forgiving, sand patches that swallowed your ankles, jagged outcrops that could turn a misstep into a broken leg, and the worst of it, open sky, no cover. And if whoever set that trap was still out there, watching, Jack's jaw clenched. He kept scanning the cliffs around them, eyes flicking to each rise and dip, but nothing moved. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the air had eyes. that this part of the canyon was marked somehow, tainted by violence, by silence, by something old that didn't care for trespassers. Her fingers twitched against his chest. Jack glanced down. Her head had turned slightly, forehead resting against his shoulder, lips parted. Those silver gold eyes opened just enough to meet his. Still wary, still watching, but softer now. Her breath carried something else this time, an almost imperceptible sound, like a half-hummed note. Not the melodic pulse from earlier. Softer. Maybe a question. Maybe a plea. He didn't answer. Couldn't. What could he say? Instead, he adjusted his grip and kept moving. The rover came into view 40 minutes later, low-slung and dust-streaked, one of its solar panels half-folded after last week's microstorm. It wasn't much, but it was home for now. A sealed unit with 2 bunks, a field medkit, and just enough power to run essential systems. He climbed the last stretch of rock, activated the hatch remotely, and stepped inside as the seal closed behind them with a low hiss. The filtered air was cool, dry, and faintly metallic. Jack set her down gently on the narrow cot and stepped back, hands trembling now that he was no longer in motion. He pulled off his gloves and crouched beside her, checking her leg. The wound had deepened during the carry. The muscle had torn against the edge of the trap's pressure clamp. Not fatal, but without proper treatment, infection would set in fast. Okay, he muttered to himself. Let's hope you're not allergic to synthetic polymers. He opened the medkit, scanned the contents, and grabbed the bioscanner. The device wasn't calibrated for alien biology, but it might pick up vitals. He ran it over her chest and shoulders. A flickering pulse, elevated temperature, oxygen saturation, something, not a total blank. It was enough to try. He cleaned the wound as best he could, wincing when she jerked under his touch. Her hand gripped the edge of the cot. She was biting down hard, eyes squeezed shut, but she didn't cry out. Jack muttered soft reassurances without thinking. Nonsense words, more tone than meaning. Almost there. Just another second. Okay, pressure's off now. He applied the gel sealant and wrapped her leg tightly, stabilizing the limb with a carbon splint. Then he cleaned the cuts on her shoulder and the thin abrasions across her ribs. Her skin, cooler than his, smooth like stone polished by centuries of wind, shivered under his fingers. At one point, she opened her eyes again, not in fear, in observation, measuring him, studying him as if trying to map his intentions through touch alone. The pendant around her neck pulsed softly, faint as a heartbeat. He reached for it once, curious, but her hand darted up and closed around it. Her eyes narrowed. He raised both hands and backed off. All right, yours. Got it. She didn't relax, but she didn't lash out either. She slowly lowered her hand, keeping the pendant close to her chest. Jack stood and crossed the small cabin, trying not to look like he was pacing. He ran a systems check. The communications array was still damaged from the last storm. He could send a short burst signal tomorrow morning when the satellite passed overhead again. Maybe, if the relay tower hadn't completely given out. And even then, it would take a week for anyone to reach this sector. He turned back toward the cot. She had fallen asleep, or passed out. Hard to tell. Her chest rose and fell in slow, measured rhythm. One hand had curled beside her face, and for a second, just a second, she didn't look like something strange dropped into his life by a cruel universe. She just looked tired. Jack leaned against the wall beside the viewport and looked out across the rocks beyond. The twin suns had begun to set together, casting a dual shadow that stretched his silhouette in 2 directions. The red haze outside swirled gently, like it was alive. He used to love sunsets. He'd grown up on mining colonies where sunrises were hidden behind atmospheric filters and orbital smog. Out here, it was different. Clean, raw, but the sky never let you forget that it could kill you in an instant if you misstepped. That was the part he liked. He closed his eyes and let the quiet settle in. The sound of filtered air, the hum of cooling systems, the faint, rhythmic breathing of the alien woman across the room. It should have been peaceful, but something gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. The trap, too old to be fresh, too intact to have been abandoned long ago. Someone had been nearby, maybe still was. maybe watching. Jack's eyes drifted to the rifle mounted near the door. He hadn't needed it in weeks. He pulled it down, loaded it, and set it beside the cot. Then he sat on the floor, not tired enough to sleep, not alert enough to do anything else. The alien woman stirred slightly in her sleep, one leg shifting beneath the blanket. Her mouth moved, forming words he couldn't understand. Or maybe it was just breath. Maybe dreams. She didn't look like a threat, but that didn't mean she was safe. And it didn't mean he was ready for what her arrival would bring. Jack rested his head back against the cold metal wall, eyes open, staring into nothing. He had come to this planet to escape, to fix machines, not people, to bury noise in silence. But silence, it turned out, was fragile. And sometimes it screamed loudest of all. The storm came like a predator. It didn't announce itself with clouds or thunder. It came with stillness, the kind that tightens the air just before a kill. Jack had been outside, adjusting the rover's secondary heat vents, when he felt it, pressure dropping, light shifting, the hair on his arms rising without explanation. He looked up. The twin suns had dimmed, but not behind clouds. The sky was bleeding. Red dust, high in the atmosphere, swirled like smoke across a bruised horizon. It wasn't weather. It was a wall, miles high, moving fast, alive. His gut turned cold. He shouted, already running towards the passenger door. Inside now, she appeared in the doorway a second later, eyes narrowed against the light. What is it? Storm front. Red level. Move. He pushed her in and slammed the hatch shut just as the first wave of wind slammed into the ridge behind them. The entire rover shook with the force of it, stabilizers groaning against the strain. Dust hit the outer shell like hail, no, not hail, like shrapnel. Sand carried with it the sharpness of shattered glass. Rayla gripped the console beside her, steadying herself. This is not normal. No, Jack said tightly, sliding into the command seat and firing up the storm protocols. This is the kind of storm that eats machines for breakfast. The environmental sensors flared red. External visibility dropped to 0. Lightning forked across the sky, silent, white, unnatural. For a moment, Jack saw the ridge they'd climbed earlier illuminate in full, and then vanish again, swallowed whole. We're losing power. His voice was calm, but clipped. Secondary systems are kicking in, but the core's unstable. How long can it hold? He checked the coolant pressure. Not long enough. Outside, the storm howled, like something living and vengeful. The metal plating screamed, as if being peeled away by claws. The comms panel sparked once, twice, then went dark. Total signal loss. Inside the rover, everything flickered. Lights danced, then died. Only the emergency beacon stayed on, a faint blue pulse beating like a dying heart. The wind tore at the hull again. Suddenly, a high-pitched snap, sharp and wrong, echoed through the floor. Jack cursed under his breath. Cores cracked. He turned to Rayla. She didn't need translation. Her face said it all. Understanding. Fear. And something else, focus. We need a brace for failure, he said. This thing blows, we're gone with it. He pulled down the emergency containment kit, tossing her one of the impact cloaks. She caught it, already fastening it across her shoulders. What do we do? Jack's hands were already moving, grabbing 2 packs and stripping the rover of anything useful. Rations, medkits, heat coils, water canisters, and AV tablet. We survive. We walk. To where? There's a mining relay, North Basin. Old, probably half dead, but might still have an uplink. She didn't question him, didn't flinch. She grabbed her boots and slid them on, wincing slightly as her healing leg stretched. The wind outside shrieked louder, an unearthly, endless scream. The storm wanted them to hear it, to know it owned this land. The back panel of the rover blew open, torn straight off by a pressure surge. Wind and red sand exploded inward. Jack lunged, slammed the emergency hatch control, and it jammed. The panel stuttered halfway, whining like a wounded animal. Rayla was already moving, grabbing a stabilizer rod and bracing the hatch. Seal it. Jack dove forward and hit the manual override. The panel groaned, slowly descending, until it locked shut. Silence returned. Not peace, just pause. The kind of silence that follows an impact. The lights were gone. The power core hummed softly now, flickering like a failing heartbeat. Rayla stood still, cloak wrapped tight, her braid flung over one shoulder, face streaked with sand. That was close. Jack looked at her, really looked. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't falling apart. She was here, steady, and somehow, that mattered more than anything. He nodded once. Yeah, too close. They left at first light. What was left of it, anyway? The storm had passed, leaving behind a world rearranged. Dunes that hadn't existed the day before now rose high over shattered canyons. The sky was dim and colorless. Everything looked scorched. Jack adjusted the straps of his pack and checked the NAV tablet. 16 kilometers to the basin's edge. Another 30 after that. Rayla said nothing, just started walking. The land was brutal, slopes of cracked salt and stone, jagged spires bent from centuries of wind. The bones of old mining rigs rusted and half-buried in dust. The wind had carved everything into strange, sharp beauty. Nothing here was soft. Nothing was meant to last. They walked in silence. By noon, Rayla was limping again. Jack offered her a brace. She took it without a word. They passed a dried riverbed with the twisted remains of a skimmer drone half-submerged in the sediment. Its plating had been torn off, not by weather. Someone's been here, Jack muttered. Not recently, Rayla said, eyes scanning the canyon. But not long ago either. They moved faster after that. By evening, the air turned cold. The suns dropped behind the ridgelines, and shadows stretched like claws. They found shelter beneath a sloped overhang of rock, old, wind-smooth, pitted with dust pockets. Jack set up the heat coil while Rayla leaned against the stone, one leg outstretched. Her breathing was shallower now. Jack crouched beside her, pulled out the med kit. Let me see. She hesitated. Please. She nodded and let him unwrap the brace. The wound had reopened slightly, red around the edges but not infected. Yet, he cleaned it in silence, movements gentle, deliberate. Her skin flinched once beneath his touch, but she didn't pull away. You should have said something, he murmured. I didn't want to slow us down. We move at your pace. That's not changing. Rayla's eyes searched his. Why do you care? Jack froze. He wasn't sure how to answer that. Not completely. But finally, he said, because you're not just a passenger. You're part of this now, whether you meant to be or not. She nodded, said nothing, but something in her softened. Later, after they'd eaten, Jack lay back against his pack, staring up at the alien stars. There were too many, too bright. The constellations made no sense. Rayla sat beside him, her hair down now, loose and tangled from the wind. She stared at the sky as if it meant something. He turned to her. What do you see up there? She smiled faintly. Not home, but not alone either. He watched her. You ever think you'd end up here? He cracked an eye open. Shoot, why do you always walk ahead? Jack tilted his head. Habit, I guess. But you look back often. He didn't answer right away. Because I'm used to being left behind, she said quietly. I thought it was your way of preparing me for it. Jack sat up. The bluntness of her words caught him off guard. That's not why, he said. I'll look back to make sure you're still there. Rayla held his gaze for a long moment. Then very slowly she nodded. They didn't speak again until nightfall. That evening, they found a shallow ridge with an overhang of stone, just wide enough to sit side by side beneath. Jack lit the coil, and the warmth began to spread between them. The stars above emerged one by one, cleaner and sharper than he remembered. Too sharp to feel familiar. Jack woke to the sound of soft wind brushing over the ridge above them, a dry sigh slipping across the rocks. He blinked into the half-light of Solvies dawn, the twin suns just beginning to crawl over the horizon, bathing the sky in a muted blend of orange and violet. The stars were still fading, reluctant to let go. Beside him, Rayla was still asleep, her breath soft, slow. She lay curled beneath the thermal blanket, one hand resting near her collarbone. Her lips parted slightly as she murmured faint words in her native tongue. Unintelligible, gentle, like pieces of music half lost in memory. Jack didn't move. Not yet. He watched her in silence, the weight of the last days pressing gently against his chest. The dust in her hair glimmered like fine crystal. The bruise along her temple had faded into something shallow, and the tension that had once lived in her shoulders was gone, if only for this one moment. It was the first time he'd seen her truly rest. He exhaled and stood slowly, stretching the stiffness from his back. Muscles ached in protest. He shook it off. They had a long day ahead. The basin was still ahead of them, and they needed to cross it before heat reached its peak. He unpacked the last of the dried ration bars, divided them evenly, and filled 2 canisters from the purifier pouch. When he crouched to set one beside her, her eyes opened. No alarm, no startle, just quiet awareness. "Morning," he said. She blinked, adjusted to the light, then sat up with a wince. "How long did I sleep?" 7 hours. Her brow lifted, almost teasing. "You counted." He allowed a crooked smile. "You snore a little. Easy to track." She narrowed her eyes. "I do not." "You absolutely do." Rayla stared at him for a moment, then gave a soft exhale that might have been a laugh or the closest thing she could offer. It was real. That was enough. They ate in silence, but the kind that had weight, not distance. A shared rhythm had begun to form. Every motion, every decision taken together. Jack didn't have to ask if she was ready to move. He just looked at her as she nodded. They walked. The salt basin stretched out before them, vast and gleaming in the morning sun. It shimmered with heat illusions that danced like spirits on the horizon. Beneath their feet, the ground cracked and splintered beneath each step, forming strange geometries that spiderwebbed outward with every crunch of their boots. For hours, they said little. At midday, the suns converged overhead. The heat began to press down like a weight on their backs. Jack called for a stop. They huddled under the angled shadow of a rock plate jutting out from the basin floor, drinking sparingly and checking the nav. The uplink tower was close, closer than Jack had hoped. Maybe another day, maybe less if they could push. As Jack leaned back, eyes closed, Rayla turned to him, her voice soft. "May I ask something?" As they sat in silence, Rayla reached up and unfastened the top of her travel suit, just enough to reveal a series of delicate symbols inked into the side of her neck, subtle, iridescent in the firelight. Not tattoos exactly, not scars either. Jack tilted his head. "What are those?" She hesitated, then touched one gently. "Memories, etched in light. My people, we don't write books the way yours do. We were what we survive." He stared. "So, each one is something you lived through?" She nodded. "Or someone I carry with me." Jack swallowed. "Do you regret coming here?" Rayla looked up at the stars. "No, I thought I would, but I don't. Even with the trap, the storm, all of this." Her voice dropped. "Because of it." There was a pause. Then she said, almost a whisper, "You remind me of someone I lost. Not in how you look, but in how you wait. How you don't speak what you feel. My people are quiet, but your silence hides too much." Jack looked away. "Maybe that's why I like machines better than people. Machines don't leave. They don't change. But they don't hold you either," she said. Jack looked at her, surprised. Rayla leaned in, slowly, deliberately, and placed her hand over his. "You hold your grief like a weight on your back." He couldn't speak. "I see it. Even when you try to hide it in strength. Even when you think you're helping me. You're carrying both of us." He looked down. "I don't know how else to be." She said nothing. Then, very gently, she shifted forward enough to close the space between them. Her forehead rested lightly against his. A Vaynari gesture. One Jack had come to recognize. Not a kiss. Not yet. But something more primal. Closer. A touch of warmth. He didn't move. She whispered, "You don't have to carry everything, Jack." And with that, she closed her eyes, resting against him fully, her arms folded around herself, but her presence pressed close to his. Jack slowly, carefully wrapped his arm around her shoulders. He exhaled, long and slow, and rested his cheek against her hair. They stayed like that for a long time, 2 silhouettes against the stone, surrounded by stars, warmth, and silence not born of loneliness but of understanding. Neither of them said good night. They didn't need to. For the first time, The space between them wasn't filled with what they feared, but what they trusted. Something fragile had become something real, and it was only beginning. They reached the ridge just before dusk, the jagged cliffs behind them casting long shadows that stretched like claws across the desert floor. Below, in the valley, the remains of the old mining relay shimmered faintly in the dying light, tall and rusted, and its signal dish slanted like a broken jawbone. Jack and Rayla paused at the edge, both breathing heavy. Their bodies ached from 3 days of walking, but the weariness wasn't only physical. It lived in the silence between them, in the unasked questions, the weight of choices still unmade. They made camp in the remnants of a collapsed cargo bay, metal ribs twisted into a half-dome, offering just enough shelter from the cold that would fall once the suns dropped fully behind the canyon wall. Jack lit the heat coil and set up the blanket. Rayla sat cross-legged a few feet away, unwrapping a ration pack with slow fingers. He watched her from the corner of his eye, something tightening in his chest. She hadn't spoken much that day. The night settled quickly, casting a blue hue over the rocks. The stars burned sharp overhead. Jack sat down across from her and passed her the second half of the food. She took it without a word. They ate quietly, but the silence felt different now. Not comfortable, not peaceful, heavy. "Rayla," he said softly. She looked up. "Something still between us." She didn't deny it. Jack leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I don't need your whole story, but I need to know why you were out there. Alone. Hurt. Why you looked like you expected no one to come." Rayla didn't answer at first. Then she placed her food aside and pulled her legs in close to her chest, arms wrapping around them. Her posture shrank, slightly, less poised, less alien. "More real. I haven't told you, because once I do, things change," she said quietly. "And I was afraid of that." Jack waited. She exhaled. A long, slow breath. "My people are called Venari. We come from a world of seas and stormlight. We evolved to feel everything, sound, motion, energy, but we build our society on control. Emotion is dangerous to us. It floods us. So we learn to suppress, to silence." Jack didn't interrupt, just listened. "I was chosen for a first-tier observation team. My role was sensory linguistics, understanding how humans express emotion through words, tone, rhythm. We don't speak the way you do, not with weight. We communicate in patterns. Resonance. You weaponize words. And yet, you heal with them too." She looked up. "I was fascinated by that." Jack's brows drew together. "So you were studying us?" "Yes. Secretly. Non-contact protocol. I was assigned here, on Salvi, with 2 others. We were to observe from a distance. We set up a cloaked station in the high cliffs. Drones, sound maps, long-range imaging. We weren't supposed to intervene." "What happened?" Jack asked. "The storm. The one that destroyed your comm tower. It tore through our ridge. We were scattered. My team lost contact. I think they may be gone." Jack inhaled sharply. "And you were alone?" She nodded. "I knew of a scavenger team operating in the canyons. Unauthorized miners. Dangerous. But I thought if I stayed hidden, I could survive near them. Watch them. Steal power if needed. But I got too close. They saw me." Her voice dropped. "They didn't speak to me. They didn't ask questions. They just set the trap. Mechanical. Barbed. Crude. Effective. They left me there. Maybe they thought I'd die. Maybe that was the point." Jack's jaw clenched. "I lost my transmitter. My emergency beacon. I couldn't reach anyone. So I screamed. I thought maybe the planet would take me quietly. I didn't expect." There was silence again, but this time it was alive, charged with the weight of everything between them. "You said nothing when I found you," Jack murmured. "Not even when I carried you. I couldn't speak your words then. My translator was broken. And even if it had worked, I didn't know if I should." "But you did." "I had to," she whispered. "Because you didn't treat me like a subject or an enemy. You treated me like a person." Jack stared into the fire, jaw tight. "My brother died out here," he said finally. "Storm got his ship, just like yours. And after that, I stopped trusting anyone. I stopped believing in connection." He looked at her. "But then you just kept showing up, even bleeding, even scared. You didn't run." She reached across the space between them and took his hand. I wanted to. I'm glad you didn't. He looked down at their joined hands. You said earlier, your people don't touch casually. She nodded. Touch is a bond. A promise. We don't do it lightly. Jack held her hand tighter. And what is this now? She leaned in, forehead resting gently against his. This is me choosing you. He closed his eyes. Her voice was barely a whisper. Even if I'm never allowed to return, even if I'm exiled, I'd still choose you. Jack's breath caught. I don't know what we are, what this is, but I've never felt more sure of anything, he said. She smiled, her voice trembling. You're not a subject to me either. You're home. Then she kissed him, not with desperation, but with certainty. Their fingers laced, breath met breath, and in that kiss there were no planets, no rules, no exile. Only two people who had finally stopped running. Later, as they lay side by side beneath the stars, Jack whispered, You don't have to go back. You can stay. I know, she said. I will. And that night, in the space between survival and sunrise, something finally healed. Not with silence, but with truth. The night was colder than the ones before. A biting kind of cold that settled deep, not just in the air, but in the pauses between words. The fire burned low between them, casting flickers of orange across the twisted metal of their makeshift shelter. The old mining station loomed in the distance, close enough to feel real now, no longer a distant goal, but something waiting to be reached. Jack sat with his back against a fractured support beam, one knee drawn up, the other stretched out toward the fire. His eyes were fixed on the flames, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Rayla sat across from him, legs folded beneath her, arms wrapped around her middle as if holding something in. She hadn't spoken since they made camp. Neither had he. Not really. The silence wasn't empty. It was expectant. Jack finally spoke. We're close. Rayla nodded, slowly. I know. Tomorrow we reach the tower. Then we send the signal. A long pause followed. Neither of them moved. Jack's voice was quieter when he said, And then what? Rayla's gaze lifted to meet his. Her silver eyes caught the firelight and reflected it back. Steady, unreadable, but not cold. I don't know, she said. You said you'd be exiled if you returned. I would. You could stay. I could. He waited, but she didn't finish the thought. Instead, she looked away to the dark beyond the rocks. Her hands trembled slightly, just once. Jack noticed. What are you afraid of? He asked gently. She took a breath. That this, what we have, won't survive the world outside this desert. That it's only alive here, in silence and survival. When the world comes back, when voices return and rules catch up to us, what happens to this? Jack looked at her for a long time. Then he said, Nothing's going to make me forget what we've been through. I don't want to go back to who I was before I met you. I can't. She met his eyes. Neither can I. Jack shifted forward, leaning his elbows on his knees. You said something the night before last, he said, that you weren't supposed to want this. Rayla gave a faint nod. I think I was always supposed to want this, he said, but I never thought I deserved it. The words hung there. Then, slowly, Rayla stood. She crossed the space between them and sat beside him, not opposite, but close. Their shoulders touched. I've never chosen someone before, she said quietly. He turned to her, brow creased. What do you mean? We're not like you. My people, we don't build our lives on partnerships. We're solitary by nature. Collectives work through function, not emotion. The idea of choosing someone because you feel something, it's strange. Beautiful. Frightening. Jack's voice was low. It's frightening for us, too. She glanced at him. But you still do it. Yeah, he said. Because sometimes it's the only thing that's real. Rayla reached out and took his hand, fingers intertwining with his. Then this is real. He nodded. The most real thing I've had in years. She leaned her head against his shoulder, exhaling softly. Then I'll stay. Jack went still. She looked up at him. I want to stay. With you. If you'll have me. He laughed, almost breathless. You're asking me if I want you to stay. I don't want to assume. Jack cupped her face with one hand, thumb brushing over her cheek. I don't want to wake up without you next to me. Her eyes shimmered. And then, for the second time, but with none of the hesitation, she kissed him. This one wasn't about fear or survival or even comfort. It was something else. It was a promise. When they finally pulled apart, her voice was soft. Then it's decided. Jack nodded. We'll send the signal. Let them come. We'll choose our own path after that. No matter what they say. No matter what they say. They curled up beside each other beneath the remains of the sky, the fire between them flickering lower now, but they didn't need it for warmth anymore. The next day would bring the outside world crashing back in. But tonight belonged only to them. And for the first time since they'd met, they both believed whatever came next, they would face it together. The morning came slowly. It broke not with light, but with silence. The kind that wraps around you gently. No storm, no urgency, no fear. Just stillness. After days of dust storms, fractured sleep, and whispered uncertainty, it felt almost surreal. Jack woke first. He lay still beneath the thermal blanket, watching the fire's last embers curl into the pale orange air. Rayla was curled beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, one hand lightly gripped around his shirt, her breathing even and warm. He watched her for a while, taking in the simple truth of her presence. That she was here, that she hadn't run, that he hadn't pushed her away. The sky above had shifted shades, lavender at the edges, fading into a soft amber wash. The first sun was already above the ridge, casting long shadows behind the mining tower in the distance. It loomed like a relic of an old world. But today, it marked the end of their journey. He stirred slightly, and Rayla opened her eyes. She blinked at him sleepily, her expression unguarded in a way he'd never seen before. For a few moments, they didn't say anything. There was no need. Then she whispered, "It's time." He nodded. They broke camp with a kind of reverence. Quiet, unhurried, but not hesitant. Every motion held weight. They packed the last of their supplies, doused the fire, and set out toward the tower. The desert was still, as if the planet itself was watching them. The walk was only an hour, but it felt longer. The relay station rose up ahead like the last page of story neither of them wanted to end. The dish was still intact, tilted, weather-worn, but structurally sound. Jack scanned the base and found the backup panel beneath a collapsed walkway. With Rayla's help, he pried it open, revealing a narrow control console blinking softly in standby. "Hope," he exhaled. "Think it still works?" Rayla asked behind him. Jack crouched to examine the core. "It's alive. I can patch a pulse signal. It'll piggyback on the old mining bandwidth, short, tight, encrypted. Enough to tell someone we're alive. And enough to tell them I'm here." He glanced back at her. "Yeah, that too." She was quiet for a long moment. "Then do it." Jack worked in silence, his hands steady as he rerouted power, fingers moving with practiced ease. Rayla stood beside him, watching, not his hands, but his face, like she was memorizing it. The signal engaged with a low hum, and the console lit up. A quiet ping echoed through the tower. Jack leaned back, wiping sweat from his brow. Message sent. If there's a patrol satellite in range, someone will get it. Rayla sat down beside him, folding her legs beneath her. The breeze tugged at her braid. Her skin glowed faintly in the morning light. "I keep thinking," she said, "about what I'll be if I go back." Jack didn't interrupt. "They'll question me, strip my credentials, maybe exile me, maybe worse. I broke the directive. I made contact. I bonded." She looked at him, voice softer now. "But even if they let me return, I wouldn't be the same." He studied her face. "What if we disappear instead?" Her eyebrows lifted. "Disappear? There's an old supply outpost. North Ridge. It's not on most maps anymore. Still has power. Water. I used to check on it during relay repairs. It's abandoned, but livable. You want to hide?" "I want a choice," he said. "For both of us. No governments. No orders. Just us." Rayla looked down at her hands. "I never imagined I'd want something so quiet. Do you?" She looked at him then, really looked. "I want you." The words struck him like a sunrise behind the eyes. He sat back slowly. "You're sure?" She nodded, and there was no hesitation. "Where you go, I'll go," she said. He closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed. Then he reached for her hand, took it gently, and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. He said, when I came to this planet, I was just trying to disappear. She smiled softly. Then you failed. Yeah, he breathed. Thank God. They stood together in the shadow of the relay station, hand in hand, watching the blinking pulse of the signal fade into the sky. They waited an hour, then two, but no reply came. No patrol, no extraction, no warning, and they were both okay with that. When the suns were high, they turned north, away from the tower, toward the place Jack had spoken of. They walked side by side, not looking back. Behind them, the signal continued to blink into space, fading unanswered. But they no longer needed permission to begin again. They were already doing it. Together. The outpost was nothing more than a cluster of low, rust-streaked buildings wedged between sandstone cliffs and the edge of a wide canyon. But to them, it was sanctuary. 3 weeks had passed since they'd turned away from the world. 3 weeks of no signals, no orders, no voices but their own. And for the first time in a long time, Jack didn't feel like he was running from anything. He wasn't just surviving. He was living, in moments, in gestures, in her presence. The days were simple. Jack restored what he could: power relays, water collectors, solar grid nodes. Rayla cataloged the land, recording sounds and wildlife patterns with a scientist's curiosity and an artist's awe. She mapped the canyons with charcoal and old data tablets. Her hair had faded to a softer green under the twin suns, and her skin held the warmth of the place now, like she belonged to the desert more than to the stars. Sometimes they worked side by side, other times in silence, but always close, always aware of each other. And the nights? The nights were theirs. They slept together in the old observation chamber, blankets layered on a repurposed cot, its window cracked open to the sky. Jack would lie awake just to watch the rise of the twin moons over the ridge, Rayla's breath soft against his chest, her fingers sometimes tangled with his. She had stopped talking about her people. He had stopped counting the days since Earth. One morning, Jack stood outside at dawn, shirt open, hands resting on a railing overlooking the valley. The suns were just beginning to climb, twin arcs of gold and red carving light across the rock. He heard her footsteps behind him. She slipped her arms around his waist from behind, resting her head between his shoulder blades. You always rise before me, she murmured. I like watching the world turn before it gets loud, he said, smiling. She moved to his side. It's never loud here. Not anymore. They stood like that, shoulder to shoulder, gazing at the new day stretching open in front of them. The canyon below stirred with wind and soft echoes. Nothing else. Then she looked up at him, lips parted, eyes shimmering with something unspoken. Say it, she whispered. Jack turned to face her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I love you, he said, without hesitation. I think I've loved you since the moment you leaned against me under those stars. Rayla smiled, something luminous and wild behind it. She reached up and cradled his face in her hands. I love you too, Jack, she said, her voice clear, soft, and sure. Even before I knew your words. I knew you. He pulled her in gently, and this time, their kiss wasn't rushed or desperate or stolen between breaths. It was patient, deep, a kiss born of choice, of everything they'd survived, of everything still waiting for them. When they parted, foreheads pressed together, hearts quiet and steady, she whispered, we built this. He nodded. From nothing. And now, he smiled. Now we build more. They stood there as the suns rose fully, painting the cliffs in gold, lighting the sky with the promise of another day. Not a day to escape, not a day to fight, but a day to live, together, forever if they chose. And in that moment they did.